The Nintendo 64 was released, hold on, let me get it right this time, September 26th, 1996. I hope that's right. And with Super Nintendo being released August 13th, 1991, and not whatever I said in that last video, 5 years is a good timeline. When the Nintendo 64 was released, well, Nintendo still supported Super Nintendo for a couple of years later. Not as long as they supported the NES into Super Nintendo's life, but still long enough to create some great games, and maybe some games that you may have rented along the way, or games that maybe you saw at conventions, you're like, I don't even remember this game. Well, that's the reason why, is because you're so busy with your Nintendo 64 that some of these games came out on the Super Nintendo after you were gung-ho on 64. So here's a bunch of games that came out for the Super Nintendo that you may have missed because you were too busy playing your Nintendo 64. I don't blame you. Just about a month after Nintendo 64 was released, we had Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on the Super Nintendo. Now, this is an updated version of Mortal Kombat 3, hence the name Ultimate. Well, that's a couple of characters and stuff like that. This harkens the lament of the question asked today of, oh, remember when you just bought a full game and it was the whole game and you didn't have to download anything? Yes, I do. It was during this time when instead of just having a DLC download for a couple of characters, you had to buy a whole brand new game. And they weren't cheap. Yeah, but if you want to play as Reptile or something like that, this would be the way to go. Now, the Super Nintendo version was not the best version of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. You would have to give that up to probably the Sega Saturn. But it was the best they could do, I think, on the Super Nintendo. And it played fine if you're a fan of Mortal Kombat and you were still playing Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo of all systems, which I did. It was around this time when, in my opinion, Mortal Kombat started becoming a parody of itself, but, you know, great game for the people who love the Mortal Kombat franchise. You ever rent Oscar? Because it's like, oh, here's a new game that I've never heard of before at the store. It's called Oscar. I guess I'll rent this. It looks kind of cartoony. Well, if you did, all right. Next, we have Prince of Persia 2. I'm not going to talk about Oscar. Let's talk about Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame. Yeah, they made a sequel to Prince of Persia on the Super Nintendo, doing the best they could. Well, and these don't look terrible, but with that Prince of Persia style, I mean, although it looks too cartoony, but the animation and gameplay style is still kind of there, but not nearly as precise as it was on Prince of Persia. Prince of Persia way ahead of its time because it sacrificed graphics for animation to make it look super fluid, and that's what I loved about that game. And this one, although it looks decent for like a Super Nintendo game, I guess it looks decent for a Game Gear game, but it looks decent for a Super Nintendo game, but a Super Nintendo game that came out like this late in the Super Nintendo lifespan, I don't know. And you still add that Prince of Persia gameplay style where you're supposed to jump at a certain time, but they don't really tell you when to jump, and you just hope that you jump at the right time, and you never do. This one seems to focus a little bit more on fighting than the other one did. However, not a great look, but it does exist. This is super frustrating. A great game to play on Twitch, maybe. Well, we have Donkey Kong Country 3, which doesn't even say Donkey Kong Country 3 on the title screen, but that's what everyone calls it. Diddy Kong's Double Trouble. Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Nice because it focuses Dixie as the lead character. So you have that familiar kind of claymation style that was super hot for the Donkey Kong Country series. And then Kiddy Kong joins the quest as well, and Kiddy Kong didn't even need to be there. Does anyone even talk about Kiddy Kong anymore? I'm not sure. But it is, if you like the Donkey Kong Country franchise, you like the Donkey Kong Country series, super, super popular, this was a great one. In fact, a lot of people consider this as their favorite of the 3 Donkey Kong Country games. Don't need to show you a whole lot of gameplay. It's more Donkey Kong Country, and there you go. Came out, this came out after the Nintendo 64 was released. I was excited to see Marvel Superheroes War of the Gems. You gotta understand, this was during a time before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was during a time when people still made fun of Iron Man. Captain America was still kind of a, okay, yeah, great, whatever. You know, everyone loved Wolverine. Wolverine was cool. Spider-Man was cool. Hulk looking great. In this version of Hulk, anyway. I was excited to see this game because it was during a time when there was still a whole lot of Street Fighter clones, and there was also a whole lot of side-scrolling beat-em-ups. And this one was a 2D beat 'em up, but you still had some maneuvers you could do to use your special moves, if that makes sense. So it kind of combines a little bit of both, while still like the 2D elements, and you choose which character you want to play as and stuff like that too. And tons of cameos from the other people in the Marvel universe too, so keeps you playing longer. It's a pretty decent game. You should check it out if you haven't. We had Maui Mallard starring in Cold Shadow. All right, I never understood the whole Maui Mallard part of this because it's totally Donald Duck. But then it kind of reminds me of, like, that's kind of the Disney thing, where Disney was like, here are our lead characters, and Looney Tunes did this too, but it's like you have, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, this, that, and the other. It's almost like as if they were actors. in their own cartoons, where one day they might be, you know, a different profession, or maybe even a different name or something like that, but it's just, you know, those characters playing these characters. I'm confusing myself at this point. This game moves very, very fast, very fluid, very Disney, with Maui Mallard, starring in Cold Shadow. What a ridiculous name. Fun platformer, a little too fast for me. I wish I could slow it down just a little bit, but it's super fun. We also have Pinocchio from Disney. The animation on this game is super great. The game itself, you know, kind of boring-ish, but at least it looks really, really good. And interesting that they would choose Pinocchio of all the Disney movies. Why have we never had the Disney's Robin Hood as a game? That would have been a seller. For sure. Absolutely. And we had some of the other newer movies that came out, you know, like the Beauty and the Beast. Aladdin was always great. Lion King. They went back to Jungle Book. And it could be, I don't remember the timeline. It could have been Pinocchio just came out of the Disney Vault. And they're like, oh, hey, we're going to re-release Pinocchio on VHS. And with that, we're also going to release the video game of Pinocchio for the newer generation who hadn't seen Pinocchio or grew up with Pinocchio. Anyway, Pinocchio looks fantastic. How about that? Street Fighter Alpha 2. Okay, well, at least we finally got away from the Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Street Fighter 2 Hyper, Street Fighter 2 Deluxe, Super Street Fighter 2, and now we're going to go Street Fighter 2 with a different look, and this is Alpha 2, so it's also still going to add, you know, some extra characters in here too. And I was a big fan of the Street Fighter series, and I liked this one okay. I still liked the original, just the pixel graphics. I mean, of course these are pixel graphics too, but you know, they changed the graphic style. You know, there are some other things that you could do on here that you couldn't do in the other ones, and I was okay with this one, but I think it was also around this time when I think most people were saying, okay, just give us Street Fighter 3 and get it over with. Of course, then we finally got Street Fighter 3 later, where it was like, okay, well, too little, too late. Street Fighter 3 should have come out much earlier. But Street Fighter 2 Alpha Turbo, what's it called again? Street Fighter Alpha 2 was totally decent. Incantation was another kind of cartoony looking game here. And again, this game would have been much more revered, I think, if it would have come out during the peak of that 5-year span of the Super Nintendo. Like, if this game would have come out like 93 or something like that, I think a lot of people would have talked about this game as just a kind of a fun, cool platformer. Kids style, so it's a little bit on the easier side, but you know, still pretty fun. But it does exist. It was just one of those games that kind of gets lost in the shuffle because so many people were all playing Nintendo 64 during this time. This was fantastic. They released Mr. Do on the Super Nintendo. No, not the Super Nintendo version of Mr. Do. It is the arcade version of Mr. Do on the Super Nintendo, a game that came out in the arcade in 1982. A little Dig Dug-y where you just have to pick up all of the cherries to move on to the next stage. And Mr. Do had a few arcade games. This was the first one. There's also Mr. Do's Castle, which is super fun, and then Mr. Do's Wild Ride, which is my personal favorite. They could have, and in my opinion should have, done a Mr. Do collection. And they could have done all 3 games on the same cart, and that would have been fantastic. But we just got Mr. Do, just the arcade classic. And I'm sure you're thinking, wow, 1982 to this time on the Super Nintendo, that's a ridiculous amount of time. And it's not bad, 14 years. But you gotta understand, by today's standards, it would be like if they released New Super Mario Bros. Wii on the Nintendo Switch. That's also a 14-year difference. Keep that in mind. Yeah, we're old. Lost Vikings 2, a sequel to one of my favorite kind of puzzle-y games, puzzle platformer, I guess you could call it, on the Super Nintendo from Blizzard. So Blizzard doing big things on the Super Nintendo even back then. And more of the same. With the Lost Vikings, if you're not familiar, there are 3 Vikings to choose from. One of them has a shield, one of them can attack, one of them can jump higher, and you need to use all 3 to get through the stages in some form or another. Like, one of them can jump up and reach the switch, one of them can use the shield to block the fireballs and stuff like that. And they made a sequel to it, which has more things going on later in the game. Still a fun game, and glad that they came out with this. Harvest Moon was the game everyone was talking about because it was a farming RPG. Now, by today's standards, we could blend with anything else. Farming RPG, great. I mean, they have golfing RPGs, they have wrestling RPGs. They have RPGs on everything now. It's no longer just Fantasy Quest. It's now you can have an RPG around anything. And farming, Harvest Moon, okay. When this came out, I was like, okay, the Super Nintendo is still here to stay. Well, little did I know it wasn't here for longer, but when they came out with Harvest Moon specifically on the Super Nintendo, I was all for it. I thought it was great. Oh, what a great idea, what a fun idea, and taking a chance and paid off big. And the Harvest Moon game's still revered today. The one for the Super Nintendo, I think, is still many people's favorite. I know it's mine. And maybe it started that thing where it's like, hey, wait a minute, we can do an RPG on anything. Kirby's Dreamland 3. Now, this was a game, admittedly, I skipped even, because when it came out, you know, late 97-ish, all these things were going on, but this was such a great looking game. It was during a time when Nintendo was also like, okay, we've done pixel art for years. Let's have fun with it. So you have games that look like melted crayon, you have games that look like claymation. This one looks like a colored pencil, and what a great idea for Kirby to be in colored pencil. And they still did this later on. That's when you saw things like, you know, like made out of yarn and stuff like that too. Or at least it looked like it, right? You know, construction paper, whatever. Great Kirby game, and it just happens to look like a colored pencil, and it's still, I mean, you can't go wrong, it's Kirby, buddy. Well, you thought Mr. Do was an old game. Space Invaders came out for the Super Nintendo during this time as well. And this was during a time on the Super Nintendo, I believe, it was like late 97, early 98, when even games on PlayStation would start doing these arcade classics to sell them. And there was a couple of arcade classics late in the life of the Super Nintendo as well. I just wanted to talk about this one, just because it was a thing that did exist. It is the arcade version of Space Invaders, came out in 1978, I believe. Now available on the Super Nintendo, because why not? But yeah, like this, that, the other, there's other people doing these kind of like arcade collections, Atari collections. We're like, wait a minute, we can, retro is a sellable thing here. We can make these older games, and people are buying them to play them all over again? Why wouldn't we do that? The game's already made. That's perfect. Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games is a game I see pretty regularly when I pick up lots or when I go to conventions and stuff like that. And it's a game that came out really late in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo. Made for kids, for sure, but still might be worth checking out. There's a couple of mini games you can play. It's basically just a collection of mini games. There's one of them that's kind of Frogger looking, but you just kind of like jump back and forth and collect as many bugs as you can in the time limit. There's a little target shooting practice thing where you can kind of do this too. There's a couple of the games on here too, but it might be worth checking out. We had Mr. Do, we had Space Invaders, and now we have Frogger. Now, at least this Frogger has been updated. I don't know if Frogger was trying to make a revival, but there's a few Frogger games around this time on other consoles as well. When there's like, hey, remember Frogger? Well, here's Frogger again. And I do love Frogger. It is one of my top favorite arcade games of all time. Fond memories playing Frogger. When I see one in an arcade, I will still play it. I'll get that high score too. But this one is updated with Super Nintendo graphics, and you know, it's still just Frogger made with the Frogger's blessing, I suppose. And you can't go wrong, it's Frogger. It's timeless fun. And that Frogger was released on June of 1998. It was the last officially licensed Super Nintendo game to be released on the console. June of 1998. To give you an idea, they released Frogger on the Super Nintendo, as well as Metal Gear Solid on PS1, Baldur's Gate, Resident Evil 2, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. A lot of great games came out June of 98, and Frogger happened to have been one of them. I also covered 20 NES games that came out after the Super Nintendo was launched. Just bear in mind, I said the wrong Super Nintendo launch date at the beginning. I just used Google, and they gave me the release date for the Super Famicom, I believe, so I just said it out loud, and after I published the video, I was like, oh, that's not even close to the right date. But I posted it anyway. It's on the internet forever. I'll take the loss on that one.